First story: The Whispering Pines. The dense, ancient woods of Blackthorn Forest were avoided by most locals. The few who dared venture in spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences, whispers carried by the wind, shadows that moved on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to anyone who stepped foot inside. Despite the warnings, a group of 4 friends, eager for adventure and drawn by tales of an old, forgotten cabin hidden deep within the forest, decided to spend a weekend camping in its heart. The group consisted of Mark, the fearless leader, whose bravado often led him into reckless situations; Sarah, his girlfriend, who was skeptical but trusted Mark's judgment; Alex, the practical one who always prepared for the worst; and Emily, the quiet observer, fascinated by the unknown. They arrived at the edge of Blackthorn Forest just before dusk, the towering pines casting long, eerie shadows. The path into the forest was barely visible, overgrown with thorns and underbrush. Mark led the way, hacking through the foliage with a machete, while the others followed, their nerves growing with each step. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, blocking out the fading sunlight. The air became thick and oppressive, and a heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. Twigs snapped in the distance, and every now and then, the wind seemed to carry a faint, unintelligible whisper. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Mark replied, glancing back at her. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing. Probably just the wind." But as they continued, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to them, urging them to turn back. Alex, usually the most rational of the group, began to feel a knot of fear tighten in his chest. He gripped his flashlight tightly, the beam cutting through the darkening woods. After what felt like hours, they finally stumbled upon the cabin. It was old, far older than any of them had imagined. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof partially caved in, and the windows were nothing but gaping holes. Despite its decrepit state, there was something about the cabin that felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and the whispers that had plagued them throughout the journey grew louder, more insistent. "We're here," Mark announced, trying to sound confident, though even he felt the unease gnawing at him. Sarah shivered and hugged herself. "I don't like this place, Mark. Maybe we should go back." "Don't be ridiculous," Mark replied, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now." Reluctantly, they set up camp just outside the cabin. As night fell, the forest around them seemed to close in. The trees, once majestic, now appeared sinister, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The whispers never stopped. If anything, they grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. After a hastily prepared dinner, they sat around the campfire, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over them. Mark attempted to lighten the mood with ghost stories, but even he couldn't ignore the tension in the air. "I swear, I keep hearing something," Alex muttered, his eyes darting around the dark forest. "It's like someone or something is out there." "Don't be paranoid," Mark said, though his own eyes betrayed his fear. "It's just the wind." But as the night wore on, the whispers became impossible to ignore. They weren't just random noises carried by the wind. They were voices, low and urgent, speaking in a language none of them understood. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to move on their own. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Sarah stood up. "I'm going inside the cabin," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't stay out here any longer." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the cabin. Mark, feeling a surge of guilt and fear for his girlfriend, quickly followed. Alex and Emily exchanged uneasy glances before reluctantly trailing after them. Inside, the cabin was even more decrepit than it appeared from the outside. The floorboards creaked ominously underfoot, and the walls were covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. The air was stale and cold, and the whispers, so loud now they seemed to echo inside their heads, were almost deafening. "This place is wrong," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." But before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous crash. The cabin was plunged into darkness as their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in pitch blackness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their flashlights, but no matter how much they tried, they wouldn't turn back on. The whispers grew louder, more aggressive, as if the voices were surrounding them, closing in. Then, without warning, a cold gust of wind swept through the cabin, and they heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Mark's bravado finally crumbled. "We need to get out of here!" he shouted, his voice breaking. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was holding them captive. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, drowning out their desperate cries. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing, hollow eyes. It moved towards them with an unnatural, jerky motion, its face obscured by a tangle of shadows. The air grew colder, and the whispers coalesced into a single, menacing voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed, filled with malice. "This place is cursed, and now so are you." The figure reached out, and as its cold, bony fingers brushed against Mark's arm, he screamed. But his scream was cut short, as the cabin seemed to come alive, the walls closing in, the floorboards splintering beneath them. Desperate and terrified, they scrambled towards the windows, but they had become solid, impenetrable barriers. The figure loomed closer, and they felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if all hope was draining from their souls. In their final moments, they realized the truth. The cabin was a trap, a place where lost souls were drawn in, only to be consumed by the darkness that dwelled within. And now, they were part of it, trapped, doomed to join the chorus of whispers that would lure the next unsuspecting victims into the heart of the whispering pines. When the sun rose the next morning, Blackthorn Forest was silent. The whispers had ceased, and the cabin stood empty, waiting for its next visitors. The friends were never seen again, and the forest, as always, kept its dark secrets buried deep within the shadows. But those who dared to venture close claimed they could still hear the whispers on the wind, faint, desperate voices calling out from the darkness, forever trapped in the haunted woods of Blackthorn Forest. The second story, The Beast of Hollow Creek. The small town of Pine Hollow had always been surrounded by stories of the dark woods that bordered its outskirts. The locals, particularly the older generations, would often warn about the dangers of Hollow Creek, a dense, untamed forest with trees so tall and thick that daylight barely touched the forest floor. It was a place avoided by all but the most reckless. Stories of missing persons, eerie sounds, and unexplained phenomena had turned it into a place of fear and superstition. But to Jacob, a seasoned hunter and survival enthusiast, the stories were just that, tall tales spun by superstitious minds. He had ventured into many forests, faced down wild animals, and survived more than one night lost in the wilderness. When he heard about Hollow Creek, it wasn't fear that gripped him, but curiosity. He was determined to explore its depths, to see for himself if the stories held any truth.
One chilly autumn afternoon, Jacob packed his gear: rifle, knife, compass,
and enough provisions for a few days, and set off towards the forest. The locals watched him go with a mix of pity and fear, warning him once more to stay away. He laughed it off, waving them goodbye as he disappeared into the tree line. As he ventured deeper into Hollow Creek, the trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional scurrying animal, were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under his boots. Hours passed, and Jacob found himself in the heart of the forest. The silence was unnerving, but he pushed on, determined to find a spot to set up camp before nightfall. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, he would stop and listen, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the woods. Finally, he found a small clearing near a murky stream. The ground was soft but dry enough for a fire, and the trees around the clearing were spaced far enough apart that he could see anything approaching from the woods. He set up his tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, he felt a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive. The silence was broken by distant sounds, snaps, cracks, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Jacob kept his rifle close, his senses on high alert. The stories he had dismissed as nonsense now seemed less far-fetched, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than he would like to admit. Just as he was beginning to relax, he heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing. Jacob grabbed his rifle and stood up, his eyes straining to see into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, without warning, something large and powerful crashed through the underbrush, charging straight towards him. He fired blindly into the darkness, the loud crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. Whatever it was, it didn't stop. He could hear it breathing now, a raspy, labored sound that sent chills down his spine. He fired again, this time aiming higher, hoping to hit whatever was out there. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound that was half animal, half human, and unlike anything Jacob had ever heard. It was close now, close enough that he could see a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the firelight, staring at him with a malevolent intelligence. Panic set in, and Jacob did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed his knife and ran. He bolted into the woods, branches whipping at his face and arms as he sprinted blindly through the darkness. The creature was right behind him, crashing through the trees with terrifying speed and strength. He ran for what felt like hours, his breath ragged, his legs burning. The creature's growls were getting closer, its footsteps louder. In his panic, he tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Before he could get up, he felt a heavy weight slam into him, pinning him down. Jacob screamed as sharp claws raked across his back, tearing through his jacket and into his flesh. He thrashed wildly, trying to shake off the creature, but it was too strong. Its hot breath was on his neck now, and he could feel its teeth grazing his skin, ready to rip out his throat. In a last-ditch effort, Jacob twisted his body and plunged his knife into the creature's side. It howled in pain and recoiled, giving him just enough time to scramble to his feet and run. But he was injured, and the creature was relentless. It wasn't long before he could hear it closing in on him again, desperate,
Jacob stumbled into a small cave at the base of a hill. He squeezed into the narrow entrance, the creature's claws swiping at him from behind, narrowly missing him. Inside the cave, it was pitch black and cold, but at least he was safe, for now. He sat there, panting and bleeding, listening to the creature pacing outside the cave, snarling and growling. It was only a matter of time before it found a way in, and Jacob knew he wouldn't survive another attack. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was none. He was trapped, deep in the heart of a cursed forest, hunted by a creature that should not exist. Hours passed, and the creature's growls grew fainter as it moved away from the cave. But Jacob knew it was still out there, waiting for him to come out. Exhausted and in pain, he eventually drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by nightmares of glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws.
When he woke up, it was still dark. The cave was silent, and for a moment he thought the creature had given up and left. But as he crawled towards the entrance, he heard a familiar sound, the low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness outside. Jacob's heart sank. He was out of options, out of strength, and out of hope. He knew that if he stayed in the cave, the creature would eventually find a way in, and if he tried to make a run for it, he wouldn't get far in his injured state. With a heavy heart, he gripped his knife and prepared for one last stand. He would face the creature head-on, and if he was going to die, he would die fighting. But as he stepped out of the cave, the forest was eerily silent. He looked around, his knife raised, but there was no sign of the creature. No glowing eyes, no heavy footsteps, no growls. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole, leaving Jacob alone in the cold, dark woods. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, a faint, eerie voice, carried by the wind. It was the same voice he had heard the night before, the voice of the creature that had hunted him through the woods. It was then that he realized the truth. The creature wasn't gone. It was inside him, in his mind, in his soul. He could feel it, lurking in the darkness of his thoughts, waiting to take over, to consume him from the inside out. Jacob stumbled through the forest, his mind unraveling as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, he was barely recognizable. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and bloodied, his eyes wild with fear. The townsfolk found him the next morning, wandering aimlessly through the streets, muttering to himself. They tried to help him, but he was beyond saving. The creature had taken everything from him, his strength, his sanity, his soul. Jacob was never the same after that. He became a ghost of the man he once was, haunted by the beast that had followed him out of Hollow Creek. And though he never spoke of what had happened in the woods, the townsfolk knew. They could see it in his eyes, in the way he flinched at every sound, in the way he avoided the forest at all costs. And they knew, too, that the beast of Hollow Creek was still out there, waiting for its next victim, hungry for another soul to claim. The third story, Whispers in the Pines. The town of Coldwater was a place where secrets were buried as deep as the roots of the towering pine trees that surrounded it. Nestled in the foothills of the mountains, the town was isolated, cut off from the outside world by dense forests that seemed to go on forever. The locals knew better than to venture too far into the woods, especially after dark. There were stories, whispers of people who had gone in and never come out, of voices that called from the shadows, and of something far more sinister lurking among the trees. Daniel and Sarah had always been drawn to the unknown. As amateur paranormal investigators, they spent their weekends exploring abandoned buildings, forgotten cemeteries, and any place rumored to be haunted. So when they heard about Coldwater and its haunted woods, they couldn't resist. It was the perfect place for their next investigation. They arrived in Coldwater late one Friday afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. The air was crisp, with the scent of pine and earth hanging heavy. As they checked into the only inn in town, the old woman behind the desk gave them a knowing look. "Be careful in those woods," she said in a voice that creaked with age. "They're not like any other place you've been. The pines have their secrets, and they don't like to be disturbed." Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance, excitement bubbling beneath their nervous smiles. They thanked the woman for the warning, but shrugged it off as local superstition. That night, they packed their equipment, cameras, EVP recorders, flashlights, and set off towards the woods. As they entered the forest, the temperature seemed to drop. The trees closed in around them, their thick branches blocking out the moonlight. It wasn't long before they realized just how easy it would be to get lost in this place. The path they had been following quickly faded into the undergrowth, leaving them surrounded by a sea of shadows. Undeterred, they pressed on, guided only by the dim light of their flashlights and the occasional eerie glow of their equipment. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl. It wasn't until they reached a small clearing that they heard it, the whispering. At first, it was so faint that they thought they were imagining it. But as they stood still, straining to listen, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, but filled with an urgency that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Sarah pointed her camera towards the direction of the sound, her hand trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It's coming from over there," he said, gesturing toward a cluster of trees on the edge of the clearing. They moved cautiously towards the sound, the whispers growing louder with each step. The air around them felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting. As they reached the cluster of trees, the whispering abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the same unease. Before they could speak, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a foul, decaying smell that made them gag. The trees rustled violently, and for a brief moment, they saw something. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Sarah gasped, and Daniel quickly raised his camera, snapping a photo. But when they looked again, the figure was gone. The forest was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. "We need to keep going," Daniel said, his voice shaky but determined. "We're onto something." They continued deeper into the woods, the path becoming more treacherous with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. The whispering started again, louder and more insistent, filling their heads with a cacophony of voices that made it hard to think. Suddenly, Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing to a spot just ahead. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. There, barely visible through the trees, was an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and broken, the door hanging off its hinges. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, but something about it felt wrong. like it didn't belong there, like it had been waiting for them. Without a word, they approached the cabin, the air around them growing colder with each step. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them from all sides. As they reached the door, Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob.
"Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure at all. But they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. The floor creaked under their weight, and their flashlights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. The cabin was small, just one room with a rickety table and a few broken chairs. But it was the far corner that caught their attention. There, in the shadows, was a figure, a man, or what was left of one. His body was slumped against the wall, his skin pale and decayed, his eyes wide open in a look of sheer terror. But it was his mouth that drew their attention. It was open, as if in mid-scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a dark, viscous liquid oozed from his lips, pooling on the floor at his feet. Sarah stifled a scream, and Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. But before they could react, the whispering started again, louder this time, coming from all around them. The figure in the corner slowly turned its head towards them, its eyes locking onto theirs. The air grew colder, and the whispering became deafening, filling their heads with 1,000 voices, each one more desperate than the last. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the cabin into darkness. Their flashlights flickered, then went out, leaving them in complete blackness. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, the whispering voices now inside their heads, filling their minds with thoughts that weren't their own. Desperate to escape, Daniel fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thicker, making it hard to breathe. And then they felt it. The cold, clammy hands of the figure in the corner, reaching out for them, pulling them into the darkness. They screamed, but no sound came out. The whispering grew louder, drowning out their thoughts, their fear, their very existence. And as the darkness closed in around them, they realized with a horrifying clarity that they were not the first to fall victim to the pines. The woods had claimed many souls before them, and now they would never leave. When the locals found the cabin weeks later, it was empty. No sign of Daniel, Sarah, or the horrors they had encountered. But the townsfolk knew better than to search further. The pines had taken them, just as it had taken others before them. And the whispers in the woods, the whispers of the lost, would continue to haunt anyone foolish enough to venture into the depths of Hollow Creek.